Hello and welcome back to another episode of Coffee Wednesday, and this is our weekly show where we get to sit down and talk about ways to bring back the pleasure of reading and self-education into your life. And in this week's episode, we're going to talk about something that I've been thinking about for a very long time, and today we're going to bring a question to the forefront, which is it okay to not have any professional experience in a professional English degree to call yourself a reader? Or is it okay to tackle complicated material if you don't have certain qualifications for it? Or is this yearning for certain qualifications when you want to read these types of material, is that even warranted? So we're going to address this question. This is probably going to be a multi-part series because there's a whole part coming with regards to the professional practices of an English degree. But today I simply want to focus on a common reader. So is it necessary to get a degree? If you want to get the most out of books, I've received my English degree a year ago in 2024. And here are some of my perspectives on the degree and how do we limit the excesses of the degree and how do we stop this idea of I need a degree to read these books? How do we stop that thought from stopping people from engaging with reading in the first place? Because one of the major problems is that people psych themselves out before they even get started. When they see a scary enough book, they just automatically assume that, somewhere out there, there's someone else with a degree that can make perfect sense out of this. Well, as someone who studied this stuff, no one has a clue. And after today's video, you might see why you just reading the book yourself and being content with an amateur might be the best way to tackle certain reading material that you're interested in. Maybe in philosophy, maybe in literature, maybe in history. It is okay not to pursue a professional degree in these things and yet still get the most amount of value out of these books. It's perfectly okay. So we got a great show coming up today. And before we start here, now you can access these episodes from a podcast feed from Apple Podcasts and Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. So without further ado, let's get started. So I want to bring our attention to this obsession with qualification before we can start doing something. So there's this obsession that we should never try to do anything. I mean, with certain professions like medicine or engineering, sure, or law even, sure, you need some training to get started. You need some sort of qualification to get qualified before you can practice this skill in a professional setting. But for a discipline as nebulous as history, philosophy, or literature, there are no hard and fast rules for how you should engage with these disciplines, so the lines get quite blurry. So the natural instinct is to think of literature as another professional degree. You think to yourself, I'm going to study this thing, and I'm going to acquire all the fancy reading techniques and all the fancy reading tools that I can gain from universities, and I'm going to use that to read as much as possible. I'm going to use that to open up a whole gate of endless knowledge. This is going to be a great investment, or a great investment in my time and great investment in my education. So this is how most people think, right? Before they start a humanities-related degree. But what's eventually going to happen is that once they get this piece of professional qualification that now you're a Bachelor of Arts, majored in English literature, a lot of students that I talk to actually lost their original passion for reading. It's I hear certain complaints. It's they're unable to read anything outside of their specialization. They're unable to make sense of anything else outside of maybe romantic literature. They're afraid to go beyond their niche and specialization because they think they're going to make a lot of mistakes. And the same here is true for people who have never done any formal training in reading or in literature. Sometimes it's really easy to have this image of okay, someone else always reads it better than me. So I'm going to resort to expert opinions from these people so I don't have to go through the trouble of weaving through or getting through all these confusing passages myself. So common reader tends to outsource a lot of this work to so-called experienced readers, while experienced readers are stuck in these specialized fields. Can you see the problem? All these two groups are afraid of the same thing. They're afraid of being amateurs. They're afraid to appear stupid. They're afraid to maybe get a few things wrong. And they're afraid that they're not reading it right. For a trained reader, they're afraid of heading out of their specialization to make a mistake. For the common reader, they're afraid to just have a crack at reading a Wordsworth poem because they think they're going to get all the wrong ideas. So both groups of people are afraid of being an amateur when it comes down to reading. But as the history points out, literature and literary studies actually had a really amateur past. So let's get started here with the history of how literature degrees became official degrees. How literature turned from something that has nothing to do with academia into something that is practiced, taught, and dispensed or disseminated as professional training for new students. So this was the year before 1826, so early 19th century in England, when the monopoly of education was held by two major universities, the University of Oxford and the University of Cambridge. So these two universities had these basically unifying curriculums, and they structured their education programs alongside three major disciplines. Number one is classics. So the idea of studying the humanities is that you need to know your classics. You need to study ancient Greek and Latin. You need to study philology alongside rhetoric. You also need to study divinity. Divinity is basically you get the training to work for the church, and mathematics. And mathematics was in the curriculum because natural sciences in the 19th century was was an evolving field of study, and it generated a lot of interest. So you need to get these three things sorted before you can call yourself educated, before you can call yourself a university alumnus. So what's happening to literature at this time is simply fascinating, because literature at the time was marginalized into dirty corners of the university or exiled into places that had nothing to do with academic accreditation. So literature was read by everyone. Literary works that we would consider as masterpieces today, they were simply trade paperbacks. And certain works were so out there in the 19th century, judging by the 19th century standard, they were so out there that they were outright banned from universities. You can't teach them in classes, right? So this fostered a climate where a breed or a certain group of readers thrived as public intellectuals. And these were the original 19th century literary critics. So I'm talking about people like Baudelaire. I'm talking about people who wrote this genre of writing called belles lettres, so beautiful letters. And this specific group of people fostered such a vibrant literary discourse outside of the university with no official accreditations. So a lot of the early professors of English literature did not hold doctorates from these big universities, from these very strict curriculums, consisted of divinity, mathematics, and the classics, right? All they cared about was literature. They loved to read, and they articulated their perspectives about poems, epic poems, and books from the past, and they simply educated the public, and they earned a living doing that. And these were, in a sense, the original amateurs of literary studies. They simply tackle these books out of love. And in fact, the root word for amateur is that it's someone who loves something so much so as to dedicate their whole lives to practicing it, despite the fact that they might never get a professional anything out of it. They might never get a degree out of it. They might never get a gold star on their forehead ever again. But they simply loved it, and that was enough. And according to a passage from John Guillory's recent book, Professing Criticism, he basically mentioned that in the 19th century, these literary critics and public intellectuals operated in the periodical public sphere with expertise that was self-authorized. So they self-authorized themselves as the one who's going to read and educate the public with their insights. So these people, instead of siding with universities like literature scholars nowadays, writing highly abstruse and difficult to understand papers, they actually sided with common readers. And their job was to be educated by the artists, and then the job of a critic is to educate the public with these insights that they've received from literature, from poetry, from plays. And that was the role of the 19th century critic. They operated in a public sphere, and they educated the public. And they earned a living, pretty nice living doing that. There were a lot of prominent critics at the time who actually out-earned some of the people from universities. So this all sounded pretty good. I mean, this is kind of like the ideal of how literature should be taught. This is how you would imagine like an English professor. This is how you would like imagine like, what's the ideal English professor, right? Someone who loves reading. Someone who can't shut up about reading. And they're there to profess this love to you. They're there to profess this amateur spirit to you so that you never lose that amateur spirit. You never lose that love that will carry you through any obstacles, that can carry you through any difficult reading material if you have this spirit of experimentation, love, and this confidence in your intuition. But then again, if you look at most academic works published in literature today, a lot of it is very much devoid of love. Half of that research reads like a STEM research paper, with a full abstract and a full list of works cited. So this is a result of what John Guillory called the professional turn in the 19th century, where a lot of occupations, instead of being treated as crafts, a lot of occupations started aspiring to a certain level of professional status. So accreditation was seen as a good metric or a good measure for a superior social standing. And even today, we can recognize this in certain professions like medicine or law. If you're a blah, blah, blah JD, oh my God, you're such a professional person. Or if you're a blah, blah, blah MD, you automatically trust that person with your bodily ailments. And the same thing kind of happened with literature during that period, because there was an active push to bring more works of English literature into the academy. And over time, the study of English literature morphed from criticisms written by public intellectuals gradually into formalized lesson plans and methods of analysis designed as training programs for university students. And as we venture into the early parts of the 20th century, these methods were so explicit that you can give them a name. So I.A. Richards called this process of analysis practical criticism, where now it becomes possible to take something as complicated and as nebulous as a poem and to distill that down with scientific precision and distill that down into a set of methods that can be observed, quantified, and graded. And this is when we started that gradual turn from the sort of amateur spirit of treating literature into a professional attitude towards literature. And this is gradually where we got the idea of specialization within a field of reading. And this is how the gap between a common reader and a professional reader started to widen. And over time, of course, the works by academies, they started to get more and more specific. They started to obsess over certain areas of the discipline instead of just preaching a love for reading. And over time, the papers became drier. And over time, the research became more and more detached from the mere love of reading. And in fact, over time, your love for reading is actually disregarded as something that you should overcome to get to a more professional level of reading. Right? You see this a lot in first-year classes, disregard your first instincts and analyze text or this text critically. Read academic references before you come up with a claim. Reference all your claims in a very strict format of citation. So I think they serve a certain role just given how the discipline operates, but this is bad news for the common reader. Because now with this institution set up, there's always going to be that extra layer of thinking where you go, maybe that's the professional way to read. Maybe my way of just tuning into my feelings, talking about how I feel about the text, maybe that's the wrong way to read. So all of a sudden, all these questions started bubbling up. But the good news here is that literature or literary studies or reading as a professional practice in the academies, this discipline never ever escaped from its amateur past. And I want you to realize that maybe if you're into literary research or if you're also love to read upon this kind of stuff, I read a lot from Chronicle of Higher Education. So once in a while, maybe every 10 years, nowadays, it's like every 3-4 years, someone writes an article about, is an English degree still worth it? Someone writes an article about, how can we even call this a degree? Why should I drop so much money on an expensive degree without even getting any kinds of concrete skills out of it. And even academic themselves, they don't even know what the hell they're teaching. Right? Maybe we're teaching close reading, but that method's kind of out of date already. Or maybe we're teaching students how to read better. But half of these students get so sick of books after the degree that they don't end up reading anything afterwards. Or maybe it's about, aligning this way of interpreting literature with progressive social causes. Right? But over time, they figured that, books and literature is more than, it's way more than just conforming itself or aligning itself to a certain period of history or a certain progressive cause that they're doing. So literature cannot be condensed down or captured into any sort of formal frame. And this happened all throughout the 20th century. Literature was always going through its internal crisis. It's always trying to legitimize itself, either as a social critique or as linguistical analysis, and even like cognitive science got brought into the literature departments to try to legitimize it. And all of these attempts are basically trying to deny the essence of literary studies, which is that it is an amateur pursuit. At some point, we have to tune back into what got people into books in the first place. It is just that blind love. And over time, the amateur reader figured something out. The amateur reading read out of love. And this love can almost solve any problems. So when they encounter a difficult passage, they can ask people. When they encounter a really beautiful poem, they can read it out loud in a salon, or maybe you're just at a coffee shop chatting shit with your friends. You can discuss a poem with your friends. So through discourse, the amateur reader never runs out of this passion for reading. But it is the professional reader that constantly have to grapple with professional versus lay reading versus professional, which one's better. So these distinctions are inherently just contradictory, and they're created to keep the English degree in a professional sphere while denying its amateur past. While I'm not denying that there might be value in genuine academic research into literature. I mean, they do great works with translation. They do beautiful works with offering us new ways of interpreting an age-old text. They offer new theories in psychology, and they offer new ways of viewing the world. Yes, the academies are doing pretty good with theoretical stuff, but when it comes down to the love of reading, this is where these reading techniques really fall flat. And this is why you can end up with a first-class honors English degree and still be no better than, that old guy who runs a magazine stall who ends up reading maybe like 200 books a year. You can end up with a degree, but that degree simply cannot replace the amateur spirit embodied by a lot of common readers. So what's the key takeaway from this historical deep dive? So the key takeaway here is simply that whenever you sit down, I'm talking especially to people who have no prior training in reading or literature, whenever you sit down to read something, remember that the whole discipline or the whole professionalization of the English degree, it was birthed out of an amateur past, and those amateurs were just people like you. We're just people like your uncle. We're just people who just can't be bothered with anything highbrow. They simply write what they like, and they use those lessons to come up with really interesting perspectives on life. And that is the best way to read, in my opinion. And of course, we can steal certain techniques from English degrees, and a part of my work is simply robbing the academy dry, right? I'm going to learn what I can from them, and I'm going to disseminate all of it in free YouTube videos and free podcast episodes right here to give you guys the tools to become amateur readers and to reframe amateur readers as a positive instead of a negative, because amateurism simply, it doesn't really denote incompetence. It just denotes that you have a love for the subject. So that's also what I'm trying to do with these longer videos, is to really explain the role of love in reading and the role of love in self-education, because it is simply indispensable, and a history of the English degree as a discipline shows that. So next time when you feel paralyzed, next time when you feel a little bit scared to read something, remember that the original or people who existed before the English degree was even a thing, they also read. When you were 11 years old, you also read with no strings attached and you enjoyed it. And that is enough because the amateur can always figure it out. The amateur can learn from the academy, but it's really difficult when you have a sense of professional pride to let go of all of that and to rekindle an amateur spirit. And for literacy, or for your love of learning to never die out, remember, when in doubt, embrace the amateur's spirit. Anyway, that's all I have for this week's talk. Thank you for staying here, and I look forward to making more of these longer dives, and I really enjoy getting into a rabbit hole with you guys. So anyway, that's all I have for this week's episode. I will see you here next week on Wednesday with more. Robin Walden here. Take care, and goodbye.